Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second panel of our conference, Trade and Empire, Productivity, Economic Exchange and Difference in Eurasia, which is hosted by the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences of Tyumen University in cooperation with the Department of History of the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, and co-organized by the German Historical Institute in Moscow. The panel today is called The Meaning of Commodities in Diverse Social Spaces, and I'm going to be introducing each speaker before they speak. And also I'd like to make a couple of logistical notes. Our first experience showed that messages from the chair, generally speaking, don't make it to the speakers because it's very hard to see them when you're talking. And so please forgive my rudeness. I will at some point intervene audibly and tell you that you're running out of time so that you can hear me and calculate the time. All that said, we will begin with the first presentation. And the first presentation is by David Darrow, who comes from Dayton, Ohio, and is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Dayton. David is the author of most recently the book Tsardom of Sufficiency, Empire of Norms, Statistics, Land Allotments, and Agrarian Reform in Russia, circa 1700-1921, which came out in 2018 from McGill Queen's University Press. He is also the author of many articles, of which I would like to point out the text called Census as a Technology of Empire, published in Imperial, number 4 in 2002, available in Project Views. Please download and read it. It's very interesting. And the title of David's presentation is called Defending Siberian Butter, Socializing its Production, Butter Adulteration, and the Promotion of Cooperative Creameries in Siberia, circa 1894-1907. Please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's very nice to see everybody here. I'm always amazed that this works. Every time I turn it on, I'm amazed that it works. I'm also especially happy that I've figured out the time difference in the proper direction and subtracted 7 hours rather than added 7 hours. I was thinking this was going to be a late night event, but it's a morning event, which in many ways is much better because there's coffee. This paper is really the first written attempt at something connected to my new project, roughly called The Spread of Empire, Siberian Peasants and Cooperative Butter Production, roughly 1895 to 1923. The main thrust behind the project has several reasons. One, I thought it might be nice to study something with peasants in Russia that appeared to work. And by all, for all intents and purposes, cooperative butter production in Western Siberia worked very well, and worked very well for many parties involved, including peasants. I also thought it would be interesting to do a case study of something in the Russian Empire where Russian economic development was not behind or catching up to the rest of the world, but in many respects was walking in step with the development of the industry in the rest of the world, and in some cases even ahead. The first dairy schools in the Russian Empire were established before the biggest dairy school in the United States was established at the University of Wisconsin. There were more Siberian cooperative creameries with concrete floors in the early 20th century than there were in the United States. And this just sort of struck me as something that was kind of exciting. This also brings up another motivation is here's a case study for the economic history of the Russian Empire, which in many respects is very easily comparable in a global sense, easily comparable to the development of the dairy industry, not only in the United States, but also in places like New Zealand and parts of Western Europe. The argument that I make in the paper, which I hope did not burden you too much, I tried to keep it short. The argument that I make in the paper is essentially that a crisis over the purity of Russian butter was instrumental in prodding the Russian government into making a serious commitment to investing in peasant cooperative butter production in Western Siberia. Now, of course, the cooperatives that developed in Western Siberia were not the first dairy cooperatives within the Russian Empire. Already earlier in the 19th century, there was a well-established system of cooperatives producing butter in Vologda province and some of the other northern provinces of the empire. But in this case, in the case of Western Siberia, this was a commitment that, although not sizable in monetary terms, was highly effective in terms of the results it produced. Although cooperative butter production never completely dominated Western Siberian butter production, it was a significant percentage of this production and also produced most of the higher quality butter that was exported to largely the United Kingdom. The other thing that I find interesting about this project is the extent to which we have in Western Siberia an interesting blend of participants in this project, not only peasants themselves, but also a set of merchants, both foreign and domestic, who are there to help facilitate the project. And I essentially am trying to make the argument then that this sort of mini crisis over butter purity in England, which incidentally made me think a little bit of Sergey's paper on tariffs from yesterday. Tariffs were not the only way of protecting a national economy or limiting imports. Increasingly, issues like food purity, as we see here in the United Kingdom, became one of those issues. How this both posed a certain dilemma for the Russian government in terms of defending the integrity of its product, but also challenged it to find solutions, and they ultimately came to the conclusion that cooperative production was the best means to ensure that the quality of Russian export butter could be improved and maintained. Most of this is based on archival sources from a number of funds at Ilya in St. Petersburg. There are some local sources that I still have not yet been able to access, and I'm very excited about the prospect of COVID quarantine ending so that I can get to the archive in Kurgan and do the rest of the work for this project. I know this is not the most exciting presentation in the entire world. I'm hoping that you all had a chance to at least glance through the paper, and I'm excited to hear what questions and comments you might have for me. Thanks.
So we can clap by clicking on the clapping thing in the reactions.
There's a clapping thing?
Yeah, there is a clapping thing in reactions. You can actually clap. You can raise your hand, but you can also clap. Okay, well, thank you very much, David. And I'm looking forward to the discussion section to talk about your paper. Our next speaker is Marina Loskutova, who is Associate Professor of History at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, who is a specialist in the history of science and technology, and especially in the history of applied biological sciences. She is the author of the book, the English translation of the title is The Making of Applied Biology in Russia, the interaction between science and practice in the 19th, early 20th century, historical essays, which came out in St. Petersburg in 2014, as well as a great number of chapters and articles that focus on the history of Russian forestry and the history of applied biology in the Russian Empire. The title of Marina's presentation is Forests and Forestry Administration in the Russian Empire in the Era of Napoleonic Wars, Lack of Strategic Resources, Export Embargo, and the Establishment of Territorial Control. Please, Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I'd like to show my presentation. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Yeah, lovely. So I think, okay, I think I will be doing this way. So essentially, today I'm going to talk about something which is still very much work in progress, and it's been like a puzzle. I'm trying to combine bits and pieces in one way or another. It has not been published yet, so I'm really very keen on hearing some response from the floor. What I'm going to talk about is a ban on exporting timber from the Russian Empire, imposed by Paul I on September the 10th, or on the 21st of September, if we use the Gregorian style. In 1798. Interestingly enough, this is something which has been known for many decades, but it's always been referenced in passing, and no one has seriously researched this whole thing. Very few historians who do history of Russian forestry recently, they just automatically assume that it was a kind of a whim of Paul due to his strained relations with England. And of course, they assume that the ban was lifted immediately with the beginning of the reign of Alexander I, which is not quite correct. The ban remained in force in Arkhangelsk and in St. Petersburg until summer 1811. In fact, so it lasted much longer than has been usually assumed. And in fact, the imposition of this ban, it created a sort of uproar in the British factory in St. Petersburg among the British merchants residing in St. Petersburg and then in other major ports of the Russian Empire, and it was immediately reported by the ambassador, by the British ambassador, who was Charles Whitworth at that time, to his superiors, to the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs in London, and as he remarked in his letter to Lord William Grenville, the problem was indeed of such magnitude as to afford no consolation. So, in fact, in the exchange of letters between Charles Whitworth and his superiors in London, and you understand that this is the period of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Suvorov is taking over Milan. The Russians and the British contemplate a joint operation, military operation in Holland. So there are plenty of things going on. Then all of a sudden, this event looms large. And Charles Whitworth, through the course of the next month, carried out protracted negotiations with his Russian counterparts. He managed to get some concessions. He managed to procure permission to export some some timber destined for the British Admiralty. However, despite of all his efforts, the ban was not lifted, as I've said. So what I'm going to talk about is in fact, well, not so much the impact of this measure. However, a few other issues related to the question of naval timber. The Russian Empire is one of the major supply bases for the British Empire, but also the needs of the Russian Admiralty related to this vital strategic resource in the era of sail ships. Well, it certainly had a huge impact on timber trade in the Baltic. Here it's very difficult to get the figures. I hope to get some better graphs eventually, but here are the way how we can assess the impact of this measure by the zone toll registers that are now fortunately online, so you can work with the source online. Well, you see ships with deals. This is just one sort of timber that was shipped on various vessels from St. Petersburg and Novoport in the period between the late 18th century and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And you can see the impact of the ban right here. Well, of course, then the British-French War that started in 1803, it also affects, and then of course the Peace of Tilsit and the whole disruption of the Baltic trade looms even greater on this graph. But nevertheless, you can see a dramatic decline of timber exports from the Russian Empire visualized here. Sorry, I've been distracted by some pop-up stuff on my screen. By now, it seems like really an almost ancient book. A fine research done in the 1920s by an American scholar, Richard Adburn. He really examined the whole intriguing question of the timber supply of the British Navy in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. And he, in fact, for him, he noticed the period of the Napoleonic Wars as a major turning point in the whole supply structure of the British Admiralty. Its reorientation from the Baltic timber towards the supply base in overseas colonies and Canada primarily, but later on in India and elsewhere. Overseas. So, I mean, he was aware of this ban, in fact, but of course he did not examine this period very closely, but he clearly identified the whole period of the Napoleonic Wars and the disruption of the Baltic timber trade as a major turning point in the whole strategy of the British Admiralty in terms of supplying its yards with naval timber. But for me, as I've said, what is really intriguing in this whole story is, first of all, the justification of this measure. I mean, the Poles Ukaz explicitly stated the scarcity of naval timber in the empire as the principal reason for this drastic measure. Was it real or imagined? And secondly, of course, my question is, do we really have a case of the competition between the interests of the British and the Russian navies on the territory of the Russian Empire for timber harvested in the empire in this case? Because clearly the British interests were severely damaged, and the admirals in London as we see from the correspondence between Whitford and Granville, was extremely alarmed and constantly pressured the Secretary of State for some kind of diplomatic intervention. As I've said, the results were relatively meager. That was not the case. So these were my principal problems that I've been trying to address for quite a number of years. Excuse me, yeah. So first of all, what I've been trying to do is to assess timber consumption by the Russian Navy, which is an incredibly difficult question to answer. On this map, you see the major shipyards that constructed military vessels in this period in the Russian Empire. So you see that there were quite a number of them in the Baltic area, on the White Sea, on the Black Sea, and on the Caspian Sea. Well, of course, I mean, I have not been able to find out exact data on the consumption of naval timber by Russian shipyards. However, what I have been established is that it is precisely within this period that we're discussing, already after the imposition of the ban, that the Russian admiralty requests for timber are skyrocketing, more than twofold increase between 1798 and 1801, and then you have fivefold increase within the next few years. What I've tried to do, I know these results, they look quite preliminary. By now, we do have a database compiled by the people from the Russian Naval Archive in St. Petersburg, this kind of a reference book by Chernyshov. And this is just basically a list of military vessels constructed in the era of sailing ships. So what I've been trying to do is to see how many ships had been built within a larger period, to see if there was indeed any real increase in shipbuilding construction that might have prompted these drastic measures. Well, the graph is really not particularly very good for viewing, but well, you see the construction of galleys has been fluctuating quite substantially, but not so much within this period. Otherwise, I see, well, my conclusion, preliminary ones, is that there was no substantial increase in the number of Russian men of war, at least large men of war, like ships of the line, frigates, and galleys. I have not yet been able to calculate much smaller military vessels built in these years compared with a larger time framework. So my very preliminary conclusions lead me to assume that more likely the whole timber supply crisis was caused by the methods of harvesting for the naval consumption. Well, basically, and it is explained in much more detail within the paper, essentially the whole system was built on local knowledge. The Admiralty offices based in Kazan, Kotka, that is nowadays Kotka, in those days it was Rochensan, and Revel, nowadays Stalin. They sent their teams to localities that people in St. Petersburg had virtually no knowledge at all, and that's how this whole system worked. My understanding that the system was really based on local knowledge, and very few people who were deeply involved in this process of harvesting, is supported by what we know about the forest cadastre at the time. In the course of the 18th century, we do have quite a number of forest maps that have been preserved, but they're all of them. They're local maps. Here you see an 18th century map, a 1732 map of the woods in Novgorod province. So you see the Ilmen Lake here. So essentially, it shows you the waterways with some trees marking the locations where you could find suitable forests. But the maps produced at the turn of the 18th century, they were of course superior to these early 18th century maps. But still, surprise, surprise, they were still local maps. You from this period you won't find any forest cadastral maps that would cover the whole area of a province or a district. You would only find these maps like the maps produced by Captain Draco. He was awarded by brilliant diamond ring by Emperor Paul I for this mission. He compiled an atlas of the forests of the St. Petersburg province, working in these years, and all the maps within his atlas. That was supposed to be kind of a model atlas. They show only specific locations. Not all the territory designated as a forest officially was actually covered with woods, as you can see on this map. So some of these plots or this state forested area, they had already been actually deforested. But they quite clearly convey the idea of a very localized vision of all the people involved in this business of surveying, mapping, making reconnaissance of the forest resources for the needs of the admirals. Quite in parallel with the imposition of the ban, Paul and the admirals under him, they sent quite a number of naval officers to the provinces in order to do all kind of a reconnaissance work to identify new forest resources for the admirals. Again, no, they were supposed to compile forest maps. These maps, apart from the maps that I've shown here, they haven't survived in most cases, but from their reports, you can actually trace the voyages of these people. And here you have a dramatic disparity, a gap between the rhetoric employed in their reports, because once you read the reports, you have an impression that they were covering a whole territory of a province to which they were sent. But in fact, if you look at the addresses from which they sent the reports, you realize that in fact they were only working in a few very specific areas. This is Vyborg province with the Finnish Gulf, so St. Petersburg will be somewhere here. And this is a part of Novgorod province here. So again, you have very few specific localities within a huge province that they actually visited and explored. So in effect, my argument is that the whole perception of naval timber scarcity was created by the system of collecting information about forests and then using this for harvesting timber from these forests. So indeed, the localities from which the Navy, the Russian admiralty, had been traditionally harvesting timber, they might have well been depleted. But it does not necessarily mean that there were no suitable resources for naval consumption in their empire, as it has been presented, as it was presented in the decree on the embargo. And it's interesting to see how this whole perception of scarcity generates a series of reforms that have never been linked in historiography to this whole affair with the embargo. The reforms, they are quite known by themselves. This is exactly the moment when, first of all, the whole forestry, straight forestry management is taken over from the local authorities, by Paul transferred to the admiralty, and then already under Alexander II transferred to the Ministry of finance. And this is also the moment when foresters' corps were introduced at provincial and district level. Before that, with the exception of the early 18th century under Peter the Great, later on the whole system collapsed. So in the second half of the 18th century, there were no state officials on the ground who were charged with the task of overseeing and managing state forests. Now this is the moment when this whole system is becoming gradually created. The first forest code adopted in 1804, etc., etc. So this is indeed this is a major. This is a period of major reforms in Russian forestry business. So I think this is that sort of answers the question of scarcity. This is scarcity sort of, manufactured perception of scarcity due to the whole system, how timber had been harvested. But then it acts as a powerful trigger for the reforms of the forest administration and for deeper penetration of the state into the localities. What the second question that I've been trying to address is essentially this question about two empires competing for the same resources. Well, apparently that was not the case, or it was not. It was not really on the foreground, so to speak. Again, this is surprise, surprise, but we do not really know where the commissioners for the British admirals, the merchants operating in the Russian Empire, where they felled and harvested timber for export, and where the Russian admiralty harvested its own timber is also quite difficult question to answer. However, the general picture that is emerging is that basically the British, they were still, of course there was some, the area around Arkhangelsk is the most problematic. This is, I think, in my view, the area where the interests of the two navies could have clashed. But principally, and this is very clear in the correspondence going on between St. Petersburg and London, the principal concern of the British admiralties is the shipments of timber that go from the western provinces, the provinces that had become a part of the Russian Empire with the last partition of Poland. And this is the area that the Russian admiralty had not yet penetrated and has no interest in, while the area around St. Petersburg and the middle Volga, of course, with Kazan as its principal basis, they are the areas that supply timber for the shipyards in St. Petersburg. Well, incidentally, Charles Whitworth was quite aware of this fact. His own perception of the affair changed within this couple of years, from 1798 to 1800, or when he was expelled from Russia. Initially, he was quite prepared to take the argument about scarcity of timber as the principal motive behind the Russian ban on export. But then he started suspecting that it was just an intrigue hatched by Kushelev, who was the president or vice president of the admirals at the moment, and Fyodor Ostapchin, who precisely in these months was appointed cabinet minister for foreign affairs. That they used some rumors about the depletion of forest resources in order to promote their own grand scheme of shipbuilding industry in Russia. I have not been able to confirm this from the data from the Russian archives, but that was certainly the vision that Whitford championed at the end of his service in Russia, while trying to explain the whole thing to London. Now I think I still have a few minutes to just to try to explain what we can learn essentially from this whole story. Of course, we are dealing here with a vital strategic resource that sustains global expansion, imperial expansion in the era of the sailing ships. We are talking about the naval timber. And in the course of the 18th century, we do have escalation of the material needs of the navies. The Napoleonic Wars, well, for obvious reasons, this is a matter of strategic concern. And this is forest historians for quite a time have been debating the whole question of the British timber frontier, the expansion of the British timber interests in the Baltic, and the penetration of their interests deeper and deeper into the mainland. The term timber frontier was introduced by some Swedish historians in the late 70s, and it's used in this literature. We know very little. It's been very well researched for Sweden. Nowadays, some colleagues of mine from Germany, they are doing that for the northern German territories, for the territories of modern-day Poland. But as about the Russian Empire, we really have most hazy understanding of how deep the British interests penetrated the mainland of the Russian Empire. So my research partially contributes to this question. And my conclusion is that you cannot really talk, or you can talk with great caution about a direct clash of interests over timber. Then, of course, the other issue, perhaps, which is even of a greater interest, is the question of internal territorialization of the Russian Empire. I borrowed the term territorialization from an Anglophone cultural geographer, Robert Sack, his book Human Territoriality, its Theory and History, where he introduced this concept. Basically, we are talking establishing territorial control over territory, its resources, through articulation and enforcement of access and usage rights within the states. From this perspective, we can see that the power of the state penetration, the authority of the Russian imperial state over its territory at the moment is really at its inception. It's really a very limited territorial control over the vital resources directly belonging to the crown. But we see how the concern over this vital strategic resource at the period of a massive international crisis generates a process of bureaucratization and the development of the professional cadre of foresters, and essentially the whole system of state or management of forestry goes back to precisely this moment. So this is the idea of my project in a nutshell. So I'm really very open to any kind of reaction, because I have considerable difficulty in writing it down. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Marina. Will you be able to?
Yeah. Just a second. I think.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
How do I do it?
Excellent. Very good. Okay. Our next presentation is by Chuck Steinwedel, who's professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Northeastern Illinois University. Chuck's most recent book is Threats of Empire, Loyalty and Tsarist Authority in Bashkiria in 1552 1917, which came out with Indiana University Press in 2016. And he's also the author, famously, of a very important article called Tribe, Estate, Nationality, Changing Conceptions of Bashkir Particularity Within the Tsar's Empire, which was published in Imperial in the second issue in 2002. It's a very interesting and important article for understanding the boundaries between different kinds of groupness, such as social groups, for example, or ethno-national groups. The title of Chuck's presentation is Sugar in Late Imperial Russia, the Particular Regulation of a Product of Universal Necessity. Chuck, the floor is yours. Chuck, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, let's try that again. Sorry about that. I wanted to thank you, Sergey, and all the organizers for getting us together at such a difficult time in the world. And I realize it takes a lot of persistence. I also want to thank you all in advance. This is a fairly new project to me, and I appreciate your patience as I sort of chew through it in some ways before your eyes. Sugar is a commodity whose trade is associated with empire, just not with the Russian Empire. When most think of sugar and empire, the powerful role sugar played in the development of the Atlantic system in the 18th century first comes to mind. For nearly 3 decades, from 1860 to 1887, sugar was the most valuable commodity shipped by sea in the world. But from roughly 1880 to 1913, sugar was more likely to come from beets grown in Central and Eastern Europe than from cane grown in the tropics. In a major reversal, the German, Habsburg, and Russian empires overtook sugar production in transoceanic empires. This European imperial production and trade is relatively much less well known than that of the Caribbean. In one of the few major works on the subject, the authors describe beet sugar as a national crop rather than a colonial one, and one embedded in the state capitalism of sugar refining oligopolies and cartels created with state cooperation. Yet beet sugar production had many imperial dimensions as well. In fact, one might say the production of sugar is very much an imperial project. After 1890, each year, hundreds of thousands of mostly Polish subjects of the Tsar traveled west to harvest beets in the Kaiser's Germany. In the Russian Empire's southwestern borderlands, Russian, Jewish, and Ukrainian sugar factory owners hired German, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish managers, technical specialists, and medical personnel to organize and tend to Ukrainian peasants who did most of the harvesting. All major European governments of beet growing regions heavily regulated sugar production, marketing, and trade, but Russia had a particular approach. As late as the 1870s, the Russian Empire produced and consumed little sugar. By 1914, the situation had changed dramatically. The empire's sugar production grew the fastest in Europe, increasing 421% between 1892 and 1911, while consumption more than doubled. By 1914, Russia became the 4th or 5th largest sugar producer in the world. Sugar transformed the empire's southwest. Per capita consumption in the empire remained well below levels in Western Europe, but for the empire's urban population, sugar consumption became routine, if not universal. In this paper, I argue that after 1905, the Russian political, economic, and academic elite began to consider sugar a basic necessity to which the Tsar's subjects ought to have access. A 1908 State Duma resolution calling for efforts to reduce the price of sugar catalyzed an extensive discussion of sugar regulation called Normirovka, or norming. The Vice Minister of Finance convened 2 large special conferences to deliberate on sugar policy. The revenue and market stability state policy made possible caused sugar industrialists and officials to be reluctant to reform it. Nonetheless, Minister of Finance Vladimir Kokovtsov and ministry officials accepted sugar as a basic necessity. They worked with the State Duma to embrace a shift in emphasis from the needs of producers toward the needs of consumers. Because climactic variation and large capital requirements for sugar production made prices notoriously volatile, sugar import duties were widespread in Europe. Russia followed suit. When in 1881, Russia began to apply to sugar an excise tax, the difference between the import duties and domestic excise was so great that economist Isaac Levin wrote in 1908, protectionism, quote, nowhere it seems reached such a level as ours in Russia, unquote. Tariffs virtually eliminated imports of sugar. Tariffs did not prevent instability in the market, however. To reduce market fluctuations, in 1887, sugar producers gathered in Kiev and established limits on production for each factory. This was the first private voluntary sugar cartel in Europe. In 1892, a poor harvest, exhausted reserves, and speculation drove up sugar prices from their normal range of around $4, between 4 and 5 rubles, to over 5 rubles 70 kopecks. Sugar producers pressured state officials to undertake production norming, which they argued would be more effective than private arrangements. All producers would have to take part, and those remaining outside the system would not be able to profit from their lack of participation. A state-enforced Narmenovka was introduced in 1895 at a time of low prices. The state set a production target for each factory in the empire, required a specific amount to be held in reserve, and established a price limit for sugar. If a factory produced more than the factory's quota, it could either keep the sugar in reserve or pay an additional tax of a ruble 75 kopecks. If the price of sugar rose, the state could order sales from reserves at reduced prices to combat inflation. If a producer sold sugar abroad, no tax was collected. The state Narmenovka succeeded in stabilizing prices at a relatively high level and spurred the growth of the industry. In essence, producers were guaranteed a high price on the domestic market. The price limit was typically set between 4.5 and 5 rubles at a time when the London market was about half that. Sugar producers also benefited from state-sponsored railroad construction and funding through the state bank's branch in Kiev. The sugar industry in the Southwest became a model for how the right mix of entrepreneurial energy, technological expertise, and state sponsorship could catalyze economic growth. 4 ministers of finance associated with Russian industrialization in the late 19th century, Abaza, Bunga, Vishnegradsky, and Vita, all had connections to the sugar industry. The state benefited from the sugar trade as well. By the early 20th century, the excise tax on sugar was the second most lucrative in the empire after that on vodka. By 1914, sugar accounted for 21% of all excise tax revenue generated in the empire. These policies had a very different effect on Russian consumers. Narmenovka's high domestic prices put sugar out of reach of most of Russia's rural population and many urban working people as well. The reliably conservative Third Duma provided little opportunity to promote political reform, but it did provide a forum for claiming access to sugar at reasonable prices. In May 1908, a request from Duma deputies that government officials seek ways to lower sugar prices set in motion a major governmental response. As the Duma Budget Commission developed its presentation on the annual budget of the main administration of non-assessed levies, which supervised the collection of taxes on sugar, the commission indicated a desire to review not only the tax, but sugar regulations overall. Minister of Finance Kokovtsov initially expressed skepticism about reform in sugar policy, suggesting that the subject needed to be addressed with, quote, the greatest caution, unquote. When the commission discussed the issue of reform the following day, the commission's chair agreed with Kokovtsov that reform of sugar regulation was not necessary. He argued that sugar was, quote, of course, not a basic necessity, unquote. Yet the revenue generated from it was substantial and needed to continue. Commission members Andrei Shingaryov, a cadet, and Mikhail Kapustin, an Octoberist, rejected this conclusion. Shingaryov argued that sugar was undoubtedly a basic product of consumption. The Budget Committee's final report on sugar policy, issued on May 2nd, 1908, reflected the views of Shingaryov and Kapustin on sugar's importance and the need to lower prices. The report stated that, quote, since sugar constitutes a nourishing product for the population, then all measures must be taken toward making it less expensive. The existing Narmenovka was directed, quote, toward the protection of the interests of large factory owners and not consumers, unquote. The Budget Commission proposed that sugar prices could be reduced by reducing the excise tax, eliminating the regulation of the domestic market, and reducing tariffs that protected domestic producers. The government must also work to eliminate the possibility of the formation of trusts and syndicates. In May 1908, discussion of sugar regulations moved from the Budget Commission to the Duma itself. Vice Chair of the Agricultural Committee, Yevgeny Shaidaman, introduced discussion of sugar regulations. Scheidemann pointed out that the crisis facing the industry was caused by overproduction and the loss of foreign markets. To address this, he proposed reducing excise tax on sugar by 1 ruble. Scheidemann predicted that much of the lost revenue would be regained through increased consumption and increasing taxes on alcohol. This would be good for the industry and would, quote, create the opportunity for the poor population to consume this necessary product. That is to say, a product without which our poor peasant and working population cannot live. When it came time to a vote, a resolution requiring, quote, the development of measures directed toward lowering the price of sugar, unquote, passed easily. The Ministry of Finance responded relatively quickly to this request. Vice Minister of Finance, Senator Josef Novitsky, convoked a conference on the development of measures directed toward lowering the price of sugar only 5 months later at the beginning of October 1908. The Ministry of Finance brought together officials, sugar producers and traders, and scholars knowledgeable about the industry to illuminate all aspects of the question. This conference was a modest affair, meeting over 3 days. The stenogram listed 27 participants, including Novitsky as chair. Representatives of St. Petersburg officialdom predominated. 3 professors at St. Petersburg institutions were also present, nearly equaling the representation from the board of the All-Russian Society of Sugar Industrialists, which included its chairman, Andrei Bobrinsky. 5 men of the St. Petersburg Fruit, Tea, and Wine Exchange attended. Since the latter sold sugar to those who used it to make chocolates, jams, etc., they were assumed to represent consumers' perspectives more broadly. Notably, State Duma deputies who had raised the issue were not present. According to Novitsky, the conference was not a public meeting, but an administrative and fact-finding exercise. Chair Novitsky's introductory outline of sugar's place in the Russian Empire stressed the industry's close ties to agriculture and how it had become a factor of no small importance in the national economy. Between 1888 and 89, 1888-89, that is the production season, 88-89, and 1908, the amount of land under beet cultivation had doubled, the number of factories increased by about 25%, and sugar production itself had more than tripled to 84 million poods. Russia contended with Austria-Hungary for the position of the second largest sugar producer in Europe. By contrast, Russia occupied only 12th place in consumption per person. In Novitsky's words, Russian consumption was, quote, not at the level that would be desirable, taking into account the physiological significance of sugar, unquote. In Russia itself, Novitsky stated, a rich and passionate literature existed for and against the empire's regulation of the sugar industry. Those in favor of Narmedovka argued that it strengthened the industry, reduced price volatility, and delivered inexpensive sugar to the consumer. Those opposed to Narmedovka argued that under the influence of these laws, the industry maintained a high domestic price and reduced consumption. Indeed, Novitsky stated that it was fair for consumers to ask why, even without excise taxes, sugar had a wholesale price of 2 rubles 25 kopecks within Russia, while consumers of Russian sugar in England paid only 1 ruble 80 kopecks. Russian consumers felt they were paying the price for cheap sugar sold abroad. The primary purpose of the conference then was to examine the relationship between sugar relations and sugar's price. Novitsky raised other questions related to sugar production and its costs. They tended to reveal that he and presumably others in the ministry had a somewhat outdated conception of what sugar production looked like. Novitsky remarked on the growing productivity of Russian factories and that their aspiration to take on the characteristics of, quote, major capitalistic enterprises, unquote. The industry had formed not so much under the influence of economic and agricultural conditions, in the words of Novitsky, so much as under the influence of the market for capital. Novitsky identified Russian consumers as primarily an agrarian class of the population. He seemed to see the sugar industry as a feature of the agrarian economy that served agrarian consumers, when in fact the vast expansion of production had required large concentrations of capital and many consumers lived in cities. Novitsky seemed most interested in the size and costs associated with joint stock companies, which spent, he thought, large sums on administration, paid more for sugar beets, and incurred expenses raising capital. In sum, Novitsky concluded that larger factories were supposed to produce sugar more cheaply, but in fact increased costs of production. This is a point which participants denied. Novitsky also questioned the power of banks over enterprises. Overall, Nowitzki viewed the role of joint stock companies in sugar production somewhat skeptically. Fundamental differences regarding Narmirovka emerged at the conference. Among participants, representatives of the St. Petersburg Fruit, Tea, and Wine Exchange stood opposite sugar industrialists. A representative of the exchange argued that any effort to lower prices left in place the 1895 Narmirovka was only a palliative that would not address the fundamental cause of high prices. Sugar industrialists stressed the need for state regulation to counteract sugar production's dependence on weather conditions. Without the stability provided by Narmirovka, the industry would not have grown as it had. An official from the Department of Trade placed the relatively low Russian consumption per capita in a broader perspective. He argued that a lack of consumption of sugar resulted from the, quote, insufficient culturedness and solvency of our consumers, and likewise from the insufficient organization of trade, unquote. Nowitzki seemed to find the arguments in favor of Narmirovka more well elaborated than those of its opponents and more numerous, but he was not ready to dismiss either side of the issue. So he turned to the production price of sugar. He and representatives from the government seemed to fixate on the idea that a precise understanding of production costs could enable the government to regulate the sugar price so as to make possible lower prices without fundamental change in regulations. When discussion turned to a detailed consideration of prices, however, representatives from the sugar industry asserted they had not had time to gather the data required. In-depth discussion was put off until another special conference with a wider range of participants could be invoked. Nowitzki convened just such an expanded conference 2 months later in December 1908. This was a much larger conference with 81 men joining Nowitzki for 9 days of meetings on sugar production and prices that generated a stenogram of 500-page small print legal sized pages. Those institutions represented in October returned with more representatives, but now were joined by 2 State Duma delegates. Essentially every industry and state institution that had a conceivable interest in sugar production was present. Scholars in this conference featured those from the Southwest rather than those from St. Petersburg. The size and extent of the meeting demonstrated the seriousness with which state officials regarded the need to supply sugar. Indeed, all present accepted that sugar needed to be made available to as much of the population as possible. Mikhail Krasovsky, a member of the State Council and of the Society of Sugar Producers, argued that a lack of nutrition threatened, quote, the Russian people with gradual degeneration, unquote. Since the development of grain production would take many years, quote, the introduction of sugar to the people's daily diet, although in modest quantities, is recognized as one of the best means to support the people's nutrition. Sugar is a particularly essential means for support of the health and development of children to the age of 5. There's an easy sell if there ever was one. Conference participants, however, differed as to how lower prices and greater accessibility could be brought about. The largest contingent at the December conference, the sugar producers, argued that consumers benefited from Narmirovka. They made the same arguments they had in October, but now in greater numbers and with more data at hand. Professors present did what they were instructed to do, to determine the cost of producing a pood of sugar. Sugar producers attacked their assumptions at such great length that it seemed impossible to define a particular cost price for the entire empire. Representatives from the Fruit, Tea, and Wine Exchange again provided the most vigorous critique of Narmirovka. The vice chair of the exchange argued that hitherto sugar industrials had become used to, quote, identifying their interests with the interests of the population of the Russian Empire, unquote. Now they must abide by the, quote, same rules that other branches of industry did and not have any special privileges. By the end of the conference, only 30-odd were present and voting out of more than 80 listed on the stenogram. The consistent and local presence of sugar industrialists meant that the conference would not endorse immediate and fundamental changes in laws regulating sugar. Although sugar industrialists succeeded in promoting their view of Narmirovka at the special conferences in 1908, thereafter, Ministry of Finance policy began to shift. In 1910, Minister of Finance Kokobtsov endorsed a change in policy from protecting nearly exclusively the interests of sugar producers toward protecting the interests of consumers. Frustrated in efforts to annul Narmirovka, in 1910, the State Duma had passed legislation that would reduce the excise tax on sugar by 75 kopecks and would give the Ministry of Finance additional means of fighting increases in price. The State Council's discussion of the legislation on April 10th seemed as though it might go the way it had in the special conferences. The State Council included several sugar industrialists and others who vigorously attacked the Duma proposals. Since Sergey Witte, who had presided over the creation and introduction of Normirovka in 1895, was present, it seemed that the project might face formidable opposition. Kokovtsov calmly defended the Duma project. The basic goal of the government with respect to sugar, he said, to prevent price spikes and instability remained the same. The government continued to need to protect sugar consumption by setting and enforcing upper limits on prices for what Kokovtsov now described as, quote, a product recognized by many as a basic necessity, unquote. If the government saw that the Russian consumer could not receive the sugar he or she needed, the government needed to be able to take action. The sugar industry had always been a favorite child, in Kokovtsov's words, of the government. Regulations had not been created for the industry alone, however, but for the industry and for the Russian consumer. Witte responded with a general defense of Normirovka, but stated, quote, probably sugar is a basic necessity, unquote, that should be protected from price increases. In developing Normirovka in the 1890s, he claimed that he himself had been thinking much more about, quote, the pocket of the treasury than the pocket of the sugar industrialist, unquote. He saw defects in the legislation before him, but thought it better that a law be passed than not. In the end, the State Council approved the law with some adjustments, and it took effect on April 15, 1910. In conclusion, the extensive discussion of sugar policy in the period 1908-1910 generated a less profound change in policy than one might expect from the hundreds of pages devoted to it. Much of the conversation was very dry and technical then, and reads very much so now. In basic structure, Normirovka of 1895 remained unchanged. The fact that it changed at all is significant, however. The sugar industry had been a fundamental part of the Russian Empire's economic dynamism in the last 30 years of the Romanov dynasty. Ministers of finance before Kokovtsov, and many others in the imperial elite as well, profited greatly from the sugar trade, and so did the empire. Sugar became a source of wealth and power. Even the modest shift in emphasis to understanding sugar as a basic necessity to which all should have access marked a significant development. In describing it in such terms, Russian imperial officials were looking toward Europe. They believed that access to sugar was an important feature of modern economies. By the late 1920s and 30s, the cost of such a feature in obesity, diabetes, and tooth decay would become better known. For officials in 1910, however, sugar provided energy necessary for economic growth. The desire to make sugar more widely available was one goal that united the empire's elite, when not much else did. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to everyone for keeping the time more or less to the schedule. Before I introduce our discussant, I'd like to remind you that you can send me your request for questions, and you can do it through the chat, through the private option. Our discussant today is Ilya Gerasimov. He is well known not just as the executive editor of Imperial and intellectual and organizational force behind that project, but also as the author of several important studies, most recently Plebeian Modernity, Social Practices, Illegality, and the Urban Poor in Russia, which came out with Rochester University Press in 2018, and also, perhaps more importantly for this panel today, of the book Modernism and Public Reform in Late Imperial Russia, Rural Professionals and Self-Organization, 1905-1930, which came out with Belgrave in 2009. Ilya, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I have 10 minutes, so bear with me while I rush through these three really fascinating papers. Trying to make it on time, -6. And these papers discuss the role of the state or empire or the dynasty, which are not the same, in the management of some basic resources. The role which was direct, or as I would argue, sometimes elusive or even questionable. I would like to proceed in chronological order, starting with a paper by Marina And I will refer to the paper that was pre-circulated because some presentations differed from the original papers. And Marina's paper presented a convincing and very well substantiated research. I would like to briefly point to several aspects potentially worth pursuing that have been somewhat marginalized, left outside the focus of the paper. Several additional reasons for the government's possible reasons for government's concern over deforestation. The paper begins the story from in the 1500s in France with the rise of early modern states and concern over the economic resources. But we probably have to date it back another 500 years to the mid-11th century when William the Conqueror in England established the system of forest law. And the word that we use, the forest, originated in the period, right? And it meant not the woods, but coming from Latin forest, it declared lands outside the rule of common law. And so these forests operated outside the common law and were close to the modern notion of preserve. So what were William's concerns? It was not deforestation, but we can say that environmental, ecological concerns were on his mind. He wanted his game to be abundant, and so he protected the forests from the commoners. But also this was about pitching the crown law against the common law, and in general making locals feel miserable. It was about the privilege, right? And this genealogy of the forest phenomenon doesn't contradict the early modern state genealogy that Marina presents. But if translated into the late 18th century terms, this would be about insisting on the privilege of the forest owner, government or not, right? And about order and Ordnung as self-sufficient phenomena, valuable sui generis. So how much these Russian forest preservation measures were about the imposition of the claim for sovereignty by the state, and how much really environmental and economic concerns. Then what forests are we talking about? Marina rightly mentions that 42% of the European territory was covered by forests, but the paper doesn't discuss the structure of ownership. The reader might assume that, as in modern day Russian Federation, forests belong to the state. I'm a historian of later period, so I know that at the turn of the 20th century, in the European Russia, except for, and this is a very notable exception, but still, except for Arkhangelsk and Vologda provinces, state claimed ownership of only 22% of the forest, of woodland. And after a century of very aggressive acquisition of forest, buying from private owners from peasant communes. In Arkhangelsk, Vologda, the rate was high, of course. And then this the physical degree of forestation was certainly not even. In Kazan province, forest covered just 30% of land, which is quite sufficient. But in Astrakhan, where they managed to produce some Navy ships for Caspian Sea, in Astrakhan it was only 1/3% of land covered by forest. So I mean that was really a challenging task to find a proper tree. So how much of the forest belonged to the state in close proximity to waterways was available? That's the question that was raised more in the presentation than in the paper addressed. In the quite significantly in the presentation, and only by the end of the paper, Marina discusses this foreign policy aspect of the story, which still cannot be, I believe, discarded completely. Pavel had these complicated feelings toward England, and then he started, in effect, the continental blockade 6 years before Napoleon did this, in just less than 2 years after the introduction of these protectionist measures. So it certainly played some role in his decision. And finally, these Forstmeisters that I mentioned in the paper, these foresters, this is the German name that survived till the 19th century, and for a good reason. I checked several persons in this who worked in these capacities in Petersburg and other provinces. They seem to be Germans. The science was German. All these Gießen professors that discussed the chemical and biological aspects, right? The cousin governor de Lacy, who was of Irish descent, but he was born and raised Baltic German, educated in Germany, and according to the famous, well-known locally historian of Kazan antiquities, Zakoskin, he pitched this theme of deforestation to Paul when Paul visited Kazan, and they would travel together in a cart to the ball, and the Lacy indoctrinated Paul, and I mean, some references in the literature about Paul personally observing, inspecting the Kazan forests and finding them in dismal condition. I mean, give me a break. I mean, it's like, well, I see this forest, it's no good because my expertise in forestry is such tremendous. And yeah, this forest is a forest. And this was as much knowing Paul indeed, a whim after a pleasant conversation with de Lacy, then could be any other structural reason for this. But my point is not about the whim of the emperor here, to stress the whim, but the German connection. I consulted this brief history of forestry that was even earlier published than this American book, this Cambridge and Canada publication from 1911, discussing the development of German forestry science and practices. And it seemed to me that the 18th century dynamics in Germany it corresponded very well to this Russian political developments. It seems to be that Russian developments echoed these administrative measures in German countries. So how much this was a discursive import from contemporary European public administration and scholarship, that was just, eye-opening, and how much it was real practical concerns. So that's my contribution to this attempt to see the forest for the trees and some broader context. David presented a revisionist history of Siberian artel creameries as a product of imperial government, whose wounded pride explains its investment into the industry to prove that English were wrong about Siberian butter. It's some Leskovian, Levsha-like interpretation. I like this revisionist take. I have just to briefly inform you that the orthodox narrative from a century ago in Russian literature, Chayanov and other folks, and in English language literature was different. It was about, it didn't mention government intervention and assistance at all. It was about the establishment of this Union of Siberian Creameries in 1907, which skyrocketed in the course of just several years. It was full of regular complaints about government's inefficiency when it comes to logistics, rolling stocks, railway schedules, especially after 1914, of course, when the war began. Where did they get the money? It's well known. In in the region. There were in Kurgan in particular, there were a couple dozen British and Danish firms present. 80% of trade was in the hands of the Danish firm of Palisen, who first began this thing in 1896. So they financed these Russian cooperatives, and then eventually they came to London and borrowed directly from London capitals. So state funds nowhere in this picture. So, and I would say that this traditional narrative, this story rather resonates with Mike Agapov's study of Siberian commercial elites fighting foreign competitors, soliciting government funds, and playing this card of patriotism rather unsuccessfully. So here we see a different scenario of the same structural situation when locals blocked with foreigners for the ultimate feat of economic patriotism without any government assistance. And this entire story is well documented by in Kurgan archive. Many documents are available online, although unfortunately in low res. So, and indeed the question arises how Russian government can control cooperative and private economic enterprises. And this is when you think that Sergey turns everything into a matter of state importance. But apparently David tells another aspect of the story, which is no less important. And timing matters here. And indeed, in 1902, Balakshin sent a memo to the Minister of Agriculture with a plan of state-sponsored cooperatives. He asked for 7,000 rubles annually in direct subsidy. This is peanuts, of course. Yeah, it's not the seed money for any business. And received this money. The plan was approved. He founded an organization for the establishment of cooperative creameries. And this was, of course, it's 1902, so this is part of Zubatov's socialism, social engineering of the time. It's a broader phenomenon, of course. A very avant-garde social policy ahead of its time in many ways. What's important that this organization, initial organization, it didn't survive the 1905 revolution. So the 1907 Union of Cooperative Creameries is completely different phenomenon, organizationally and ideologically and financially. It's exactly for this reason that all new cooperative movement, its elite and ideologues censored the role of the government in assisting its takeoff. And the role was there. It was not direct, but of course the investment in education, logistics, most important is in police control. It's not about money, it's about giving them a break in terms of administrative control. This was important. And the book that Sergey mentioned was about this complex dialectics of government and society efforts to modernize. And finally, Chuck Steinwedel speaks of the doubtless government business. And I would suggest to frame this story by the concept of sugar beets parastatal complex, to borrow Holquist's term. And in this case, this is really, this is about real stuff rather than ideological projections. This is an early example of the Dutch disease of sorts. Cartels are bad enough for the economy, but when the government becomes part of the cartel, it's pretty hopeless. And sugar became the second source for the excise revenues after vodka. After the Japanese War, daily ration of Russian soldiers included 13 grams of sugar, 3 spoons of sugar a day, and it's a huge standing army, right? Sugar was a key export commodity, and railway tariffs were 50% lower for the freight directed over abroad than traveling the same line but to a local destination. So the state just couldn't easily disentangle when it got involved into this business. It became a hostage of its involvement in the very new and modern economic sector with influential lobbyists, as Charles shows. And on the ground, sugar beets production began transforming agricultural economy. Not only thousands of peasants began cultivating beets as monoculture, they were integrated into the production cycle as hired workers rather than farmers on their own land. They were paid fixed rates. They were supplied by seeds and equipment. So when nationalization came several years later under the Bolsheviks, it was almost seamless. I mean, they're already part of this economic segment of this parastatal complex. And another aspect of this parastatal complex, of course, is this that the Marina suggested that plant owners became involved in politics and advancing their liberal but still state-oriented agenda through lobbying in the State Duma. And the fact that State Duma had to discuss these purely economic matters speaks volumes, of course, on the degree of statism in this sector. The disproportionately high prices of sugar on the domestic market were regulated by state intervention, or could be only regulated by state intervention. Sugar became a honey trap of modern statism, originating not in abstract theories, but in greed and egoistic pursuit of dolce vita. It was, of course, the story explicates the dark side of Russian modernity that precedes very important and grim developments further in the 20th century. And so these papers offer a fresh, in my view, perspective on the complex nexus of the state and social groups and global ideas, and show how the relatively small imperial state could be efficient, and what instruments were at its disposal, not necessarily the government, proper government agencies only. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Ilya. Thank you very much. We have a little queue for to ask questions. So I suggest that we gather the questions, and then I'll give each speaker a little bit of time to respond to Ilya's comments and the questions addressed to them. So I will also ask of people who ask questions to be brief so that we can give the participants time. Marina, please, you go first.
Thank you for this wonderful, very interesting panel and stimulating papers. And I have questions for Marina and for Chuck. For Marina, my question is somehow it resonates with what Ilya said, but basically it goes back to the initial idea for the conference to combine the kind of new imperial history optics with economic history optics. And so the question is about territorialization as a kind of a framework for you in this project, which in my understanding is a kind of an extension of modernity paradigm, which imagines the modern state as acting towards establishing control and through control over territory in particular. And so I just wonder whether it would be more beneficial for your goals in this project to introduce conflict, or at least a kind of an imperial perspective which allows for coexistence of multiple logics which kind of undermine maybe or reinforce each other. And in particular, what I mean is maybe different kind of regimes of ownerships or expectation of ownerships and practices of ownership and usage of forests in different localities, which would allow you to maybe relativize this kind of modernity idea of a state that consciously is trying to establish this very modern kind of control over the resources and introduce multiplicity of ideas and relationships to property and ownership that existed in the empire. So this is for Marina, and my question for Chuck, I think it's really fascinating project, but since you mentioned Andrew Zimmerman and his book, and to him, this kind of economic history is a way to come up with a very interesting social, political, and even intellectual history. And so my question is, what, like going forward, how do you see the place of social history or political history in your project? And in particular, from like the pieces of information that I, have about those elites engaged in beet sugar industry in southern Russia, they were, initially Polish, then they were forced out by Jewish elites. The kind of technological side of the production, the relationships between local peasants and owners. Also, from what I know about the kind of lobbyist efforts and the organization of this industrialists, they were kind of left liberal leaning, and during the first Russian Revolution they advanced a more kind of liberal agenda. So I wonder how do you see this story as being part of a larger story about maybe consolidation of kind of non-Russian elites and alternative agendas, and also empowering, say, Jewish elites or again non-Russian elites in southern Russian region? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Marina. The next question I have is from Ilya here. Ilya, could you please unmute yourself? Do you have a question? Yes, please, go ahead, ask the question.
Yeah, so I had a question for Professor Darrow, and thank you everyone for a wonderful presentation. I didn't get the pre-circulated paper, if there were any, but I just had a question about this crisis of butter purity in the discourses. So what was at stake in these discourses? Was it more about nationalism or protectionism or impacts on health, and why the purity of the butter was such a problematic issue? And I kind of situate this in the, I guess, broader context in the late 19th century, when in Europe there were like new butter alternatives coming up, the margarine, and mainly in France, but later I guess in Germany and other places as well. So to kind of put it together, why this crisis over butter purity was an issue. Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Alexander Kondrashov.
Hello. Do you hear me? Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Charles about these sugar debates. I wonder what place in these debates were for, I don't know how to say, colonial or political view on sugar. Like, was there any arguments that sugar can be exported to some places like maybe Iran, Afghanistan, or China, places where Russian Empire tried to settle influence? Yes, that's my question.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Nicola Pianciola.
Yes, hello. I have a question for Charles Steinwedel. I was wondering, how much do you see your research about sugar beet production in the Russian Empire as part of a history of a trans-imperial region, kind of a sort of sugar beet belt? But it's nice to see that Europe's bloodlands had been also sugarlands before the 20th century. And so I know that it's a bit out of the focus of your paper, but I was wondering whether you can say something about the peasants. So I was wondering whether there were circular migrations of Ukrainians working in the German Empire and then working in Tsarist soil and so on and so forth. It's tempting to see some parallel of this trans-imperial migration between this area and the area that Sergey Glebov has talked about yesterday, especially in terms of racialized discourses. We know about Weber talking about the Polish peasants having different built stomachs and so on. But also Weber was talking about the social consequences of the expansion of sugar beet production. And some observers in the Russian empires, among them Pavel Garukov, connected the expansion of sugar beet with peasant unrest during the 1905 revolution. So I was wondering whether this was a factor in the interest on regulating the industry after 1905.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is from Tiayin Xu. Tiayin, please.
Yes,
right.
Thank you very much, Sergey. And thank you all for your papers, Marina, David, and Chuck. They're wonderful papers. My question is for David and Chuck. And I am struck by the high volume of export that both your papers talk about, at least until 1910. And I want to ask you about the relationship between export and import. So the classic model for a colony, which Vita is very well aware, of which he's well aware, is that a colony is the model says that colony exports raw material and imports manufactured goods, basically allowing the metropole to dump its excess production. Now here, you're talking about the export of processed goods. So it's not quite raw material, but at the same time, this export seems to have, at least at first, skip a concern with domestic consumption. So this is a situation where you have a commodity that is highly exported, but very little domestic consumption. And I guess my question is, how does this modify or revise the classic model of colonialism or colony metropole relationship? And this kind of relates to the question that Alexander Kondrashev just asked about, are there concerns about exporting sugar to Central Asia and Asia? And then the other question sort of related to that high level of export is how, especially regarding Siberian sugar, butter, how does that sort of fit in with the same sort of the advocacy for tariffs in the Russian Far East at this point? Because there's a great deal of argument for erecting tariffs in the Russian Far East, which Sergey talked about yesterday, but I also know that a lot of the argument is about erecting tariffs against Manchurian production, even though some of the products from Manchuria is in fact produced by Russian growers. So how does that work? And finally, I have a question really more directed about the pattern of domestic consumption. How much of the butter was used domestically that was produced? And I think what Chuck is trying to trace is an overall change of a greater trend towards domestic consumption. But so I wonder if that has, significantly changed. And a very final quick question is, both your paper talked about speculation or unwelcome market behavior. What does that really mean? What is really understood by speculating on sugar? Or what is exactly unwelcome market behavior with regard to butter? Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we'll take two more questions that I have recorded, and then I'll give time to the presenters to respond. First is from Pavel Demchenko. Pavel, please.
Thanks. My question would be for Maria Viktorovna. So thanks for the report. I really do appreciate your idea about the internal knowledge. And my question is about two ports that you somehow mentioned, the Riga and Vyborg. So we had a lot of sawmills near the Vyborg, and you somehow showed them. And my question about Vyborg was there, could there be significant illegal sales of timber, so the sales that couldn't be observed by imperial actors. And about Riga, the question is that, as I remember, so I do not know about the end of the century, there was no ban to sell the Lithuanian timber, and you somehow mentioned it in your paper. So was there any, so if we're talking about the scarcity of the wooden resources, were they taken into the account the number of Lithuanian timber or Polish timber that were going through Riga port? Because as I saw in Zuntal registers, there was some significant sales of timber in Riga, despite St. Petersburg during the 18th century, but maybe the situation was changing. And so, like the general question, so was it like the empire's ignorance or lack of knowledge, what you are talking about? Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And the last question is from Nona Shakhnazarian. Please, Nona.
I'm trying to unmute. Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. It's very nice to be part of this conference. Thank you very much to all panelists for this great panel. And I would like to address my question to Charles, please. I find this sugar topic very interesting because of the modern context of sugar export and import in Armenia, because from Russia, because this criminal oligarchic regime and some special oligarchs, Armenians, who were involved all this post-Soviet, post-socialist time, get involved in this sugar export from Russia. They actually monopolized this domain, and I understand because this is really basic necessity product and very lucrative. And I would like to ask if historically this sugar export from Russia to other places, I mean, maybe this is out of your research topic, but if you have this side material, maybe you can hint at the history of monopolization historically, how if this sugar production and especially export was monopolized, and if we can historically speak about this criminal oligarchic kind of economic behavior.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to give the presenters time to respond to the accumulated questions in the same order in which the presentations were made. We'll start with David Darrow, and I'll ask the presenters to keep their presentations to about, well, 8 minutes or so. Please, David. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for, especially Ilya, for your thoughtful commentary. In terms of the question about the crisis of butter purity, most of this butter is going exclusively to the United Kingdom. Some of the butter, it's all produced for export. This is why the quality of the butter is so important, and why the usual Russian domestic butter, while initially suitable for sale and export because it was cheap, increasingly became less suitable. Most of this butter in the United Kingdom is used for making tea biscuits and things like that. Some gets exported to Germany, but the United Kingdom is really the main market. And by the end of the 19th century, the United Kingdom had a well-established pattern of passing food purity legislation. And I mean, one of the interesting things that comes from all the papers, I think, is we see a general trend of states having to manage favoring the interests of consumers as well as producers, and food purity was an arena where both of these things met. So on one, it was protecting domestic producers to pass food purity laws. At the same time, it was also argued that it was protecting the interests of consumers. And in terms of butter, there were many ways that butter could be adulterated, but the chief method of adulteration was either mixing it with margarine or adding extra water to increase the weight. And so for the Russian government, this rash of cases in 1901, 1902, where the customs chemist was, deeming that the Russian butter was not pure, was not just a commercial embarrassment, but also I would say an imperial embarrassment, especially given the import of these exports using the Trans-Siberian Railway for the sort of imperial prestige. Very little of this butter was consumed domestically. It was all for export. Of course, this changes after 1914, 1915 with the outbreak of the war, when despite attempts to keep export markets open by shifting transport patterns, the export markets evaporated. The Union of Siberian Creamery Cooperatives managed to secure the contract for supplying butter for the army. And it's in this way that Siberian producers really began producing, I guess we could say, for a domestic market. The question about what this all says about the narrative, the typical narrative of the relationship between the colony and the metropole is interesting. In fact, one of the things that I found interesting about this project and butter in particular was butter is a value-added commodity. It is not just simply putting grain on a barge and shipping it someplace. There's labor added to it, and it also symbolizes this growing industrialization of agriculture. One of the points I make in the paper is the relationship between agriculture and industry, that we're used to thinking of this as two separate things. We all have fallen victim to the idea that industry is somehow more civilized and advanced, and the agriculture is the old way of doing things. But the reality is that industry, especially as it developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, could not exist without the fats and fibers that came from the field. And butter, sugar, tea, coffee, these things were really what fueled workers, and their production in itself created a whole separate industry of providing the various industrial tools to produce butter, mechanical cream separators, advanced churns. And of course, for me, one of the more interesting things is the whole idea of peasants producing to chemical standards, the location of testing labs in the field in Kurgan and Petropavlovsk, and the results of the testing labs being regular publication in the local newspapers, and peasants trying not only to, or peasant cooperatives trying not only to produce so as to increase their own profits, but also produce according to some sort of international standard of export quality butter. I'm not sure if I answered everybody's questions, in part because I've gotten to the point in my life where I can no longer read my own handwriting and can't see what I've written here on this piece of paper. But I hope I've answered most of them adequately, and am welcome to take questions offline later if I missed something.
All right. Thank you, David. Marina?
Right. Well, I will first try to reply to Ilya's ideas and criticisms. Well, let me start with the easiest questions to address, namely the issue of politics, Paul the First personality, etc. Well, in a way, I do argue against this very superficial interpretation which has made its way into a recent book by Eugenia Lupanova, where she also treats this issue also very much in passing. Certainly, Paul went to Kazan, and that was a part of the preparation for these measures, and he was appalled by the state of the forest, the old groves he saw there. But I think the importance of this trip is exaggerated. Well, and again, it was not a whim, because Kazan was strategically important. It was the only province where they had plantations, artificial plantations of timber forests, timber wood. Namely oaks. So he really inspected the very specific wooded areas that had been planted and maintained for shipbuilding, and they were absolutely crucial, because I mean, when we're talking about ship timber, the first thing is we need to realize is that this is a very difficult commodity to talk about. We have to differentiate between the different species. I mean, oak is not the same as pine, and they're both needed for naval construction. Again, you need different types of trees for certain parts of a ship. You need curved trees that had to be more or less specifically planted. So he was this whole business about inspecting oak groves in Kazan province. It was certainly not a whim of a half-crazed emperor. It was an inspection of strategic resources. So it was part of a picture, but it was not some kind of an emperor passing by, having a look and saying, well, this is awful, we need to do something about it. But even more so, I mean, the idea that this measure was somehow directed against England, we need to keep in mind that this is the period when foreign policy is changing very rapidly, and the year 1798 is the period when the relations between Britain and Russia are perfectly fine. They are really working together, planning a future joint military operation in Holland. It's only in 1799 when the situation gets much more difficult, and in spring 1800, Whitford is already he would be eventually expelled from the empire upon Paul's insistence after the Russians had intercepted a secret depeche where Whitford explicitly doubted Paul's sanity, but that would happen about 2 years later. So this is the moment when Whitford himself had very high expectations concerning Paul, and he was lauding him, praising him all the time when writing to Grant. So it's he assures repeatedly the Secretary of State that this is not a measure directed against Britain, and in fact there is one good thing about that the French would not be able to ship any timber from Russia because the ban applies to all countries. So this is, you know, I'm very much aware about the political dimension of the story, but I deliberately did not want to break it into the picture because I'm concerned about the larger issues and the larger chronological framework. About the German influence. Well, this is again something. I mean, I do acknowledge it. But part of my argument is explicitly directed against this assumption. The thing is that this is the moment when, in fact, German forestry is also in the making. The Bavarian Royal Forestry Academy in Aschaffenburg would be founded only in 1807. The Royal Academy in Tarrant in Saxony, Forestry Academy, in 1811. Interestingly enough, because it is the Admiralty who is still in charge of timber harvesting and forestry by extension. This is the moment when the Russians sent a few forest officials to England to learn about forest management. So our assumption that Russian forestry is, you know, basically modeled along the German lines, it comes from a bit later period. It would happen in the 1830s when the Russian forestry will be modeled along the German lines. And the first generation of Russian forest officials, yes, they have this German name as the title of their office. But I mean, I've examined very carefully who were these people who were recruited to staff these offices. They were mostly Russians. Well, a few Baltic Germans in the German provinces, but otherwise Russians and Poles. And they were former Navy officers with a long record of actual service on the man of war, with virtually no very little experience of forestry. So there is very little German connection at this period. Now, concerning the larger issues that we've been talking about, well, it's plain evident that environmental concerns are, you know, are not the reason behind the forestry reforms, and not even economic concerns. But these people are thinking along the. They've been shaped by their service in the Navy. They are thinking about a supply of strategic resource for military shipbuilding, and this is the logic that drives these reforms. What else have you been really? Oh, yeah, about the structure of ownership that I have not really addressed. Again, as you've said, this is a question when you have so many things, so it's difficult to distinguish the woods behind the trees, so to speak. The structure of ownership. Well, it's under Catherine when basically the state, or rather the Admiralty, is losing its right to harvest trees in private forests. But however, on the ground, you still have large forest areas where the forests owned by private owners and territories owned by the state, they have not been demarcated yet. And this process, it doesn't intensify in this period under Paul and under Alexander. So the Alexander's reign is in a way continuation of the policies that have been already laid under Paul. But the thing is, it's yeah, thank you for reminding me about time. And I've been concerned with, well, of course, with the state-owned woods because they are documented. We have virtually no knowledge about. That's what I've been trying to find out. But it's almost impossible to find out what happens in privately owned forests. So that's why I've been talking about. But since the days of Catherine, the Admiralty lost its right to fell trees in for its own consumption in privately owned forests. What Marina mentioned, well, about this framework again, I would love to see. I love to see other forces acting in the forests. I would like to see, because once you read the documents, you realize that there is a huge timber industry operating there, but it's off the record because it's only the state who is the agency that leaves the documents. We have very limited access to the actions of other actors in this thing. Pavel, well, I could answer that to you personally, but basically this is after the third partition of Poland. So, and you are dealing with a slightly earlier period. So this Polish and Lithuanian timber has already become effectively the Russian timber. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, very much. Chuck, the floor is yours. I know we are leaving you very little time, but we can go a couple of minutes over the limit.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ilya, for your questions and for a lot of stimulating questions. Nona asked me to address her question first since she is imminently losing electricity. So I'll start with her question. I actually haven't seen a discussion of criminal oligarchic activity referred to in any of my sources. Doesn't mean that it didn't exist. To the extent it did is that as these events are going on in 1910, the sugar producers meet in Kiev in an unsanctioned, like sort of a private meeting that they don't even inform the ministry about, and that's seen as some, unsavory behavior. But I don't see I haven't seen it yet. It could be there. I just don't see that sort of this kind of behavior described as criminal. It's seen as maybe unreasonable or going against the interests of consumers, but not as criminal. To sort of connect that briefly with Alexander's question about exports to Iran, Finland, et cetera, yes, very much. In 1902, Russia is shut out of the European sugar market by the Brussels Sugar Convention, and there are complicated reasons behind this, which I had to cut from the paper. But the result is an increased focus on exporting sugar to those territories that are not part of the European conventions and are seen as more welcoming or more fertile ground for Russian sugar exports. So Persia, Iran is mentioned as one, Finland, as I say, and there is some movement towards emphasis on Central Asia and even in Siberia, but this seems to come very late, very shortly before the war, and I just haven't been able to explore this going forward. On going back to sort of taking it from the top now, Ilya's question, and obviously many stimulating ideas here. The peristatal complex, I think, is something that is useful, and I'll have to think that through. Certainly, I think that what we're seeing in the sugar industry makes nationalization much easier than it otherwise might have been, for some of the reasons that you would guess, and some like the fact that Russian sugar was not branded. And so you can imagine that, in the West, we have C&H, pure cane sugar from Hawaii growing in the sun and so on. You didn't have this kind of branding. And so you had, it's easier to see how the very experience of consuming it would be more seamless. You're not seeing a destruction of brands, but sort of the same package that you got your sugar in is now could be sold to you by the Soviets. As far as another take on the peristatal complex, I think part of what's motivating this paper is an interest in sort of challenging that to a small extent. I'm not, and I haven't really come down firmly yet. And that is that I think there's an assumption that the state and the sugar producers are always working very much hand in hand. And to a certain extent, this is true. But I think you see in 1910, when we finally get a minister of finance who's not sort of as deeply connected to the sugar regions, Kokovtsov, that, he starts to back away from some of these policies. And to us, and believe me, when I'm reading 500 pages of single space, small type, legal size pages on the conference, the difference seem very small. But in other ways, when you read the reaction of the sugar producers, they're enraged. They can't believe this is an attack on the industry. It's going to destroy the sugar industry. I mean, and some of this, I think, is, clearly political positioning, but some of it, I think, is there's a real sense that the state is betraying the interests of the sugar producers. On Marina's questions, very thought-provoking, clearly, regarding, I do have long-term agendas for all of these dimensions. Political history, there is a consolidation of an elite especially in the borderlands. Just one tidbit that indicates this: Bobrodinsky is known as a kind of Russian nationalist of a sort, and is the chair of the sugar industrialists. The second in command is Brodsky, a Jew who is also a factory owner. And it's very clear this is intentional. That is, we have a Russian to work in Petersburg, but this is very much a multicultural, multinational, multi-confessional industry. With respect to social history, I see fertile ground in looking at the experience of production. That is, you see, I think there are particular reasons why the industry takes off in this region, and it has a lot to do with very small plots that the peasants hold. They can't sustain themselves. And so they have a need to work in sugar factories, and they don't really have much of a choice. Now, this is far from slavery, don't get me wrong, but that it seems like this industry is based upon having sort of a captive labor pool, or one that can be fairly easily coerced or limited. For economic history, I mean, my sort of direction there, I'm really interested in looking at Russian capitalism and what the sugar industry says about it, because you see in certain trends toward a liberalization, increasing the importance of markets, but at the same token, you see, the state very much wants to hold this very close together. So, but those are three trajectories, all of which I think are certainly worth exploring further. Regarding Nicolo's question on migration, this is something I'm only beginning to understand, and so forgive me. You certainly see the reference to the large-scale migration of Polish peasants to work in the German beet fields, and it's actually, the Zimmerman makes the point that that their presence was something that Max Weber encountered and made him very skeptical of the Catholic spirit, we might say. I don't know as much about movements within Russian and cross-border movements. In Ukraine, I think it's more about Ukrainian peasants moving around, and that this, the harvest really sucks in labor from all over the Southwest. But I just don't have a sense of who, as far as the labor force is migrating, though you do certainly see it in terms of managers and specialists who often are German, some from Austria-Hungary, some from Germany, who come across the border to work in factories. So you certainly, that's something that I definitely want to follow up on. Chia Yinsu's got an excellent big question about the exports of raw materials. I would say two things to this. Part of it is what I think David said very well in his response to the questions, that sugar and like butter is something that is sort of, I mean, we like to think of, here are agricultural crops, here are industrial crops. But these are things that very much are sort of hard to pigeonhole. I mean, obviously they depend upon agriculture, but you can't just ship beets somewhere. You have to refine them. This takes capital, technology, specialists. And so it definitely is not purely a raw material. But what I would say, and I think this is where I'm going both in this paper, but more broadly, that I think it's easy as the authors on this work on the industry in this the history of globalization from the Harvard U Press topic mentions that seeing this as a national industry, when I think there is something very colonial about it, in that you have the capital is provided largely by outsiders, some from abroad, some from Central Russia, that you then produce this material and sort of pump it out to the rest of the world so that you can make excise tax on it, so that you can, it helps Russia's trade surplus. That is, I think, and I'm trying to argue, trying to at least put the Russian industry in the context of these larger conceptions of sugar as a commodity, a kind of colonial commodity, even though we have a different sort of specific nature of colonies. So I thank you for that, and I definitely want to have to think that through as I work forward. I think that is about it, and I thank you again for the stimulating questions.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck, and thank you everyone for trying to keep to the time. I have to apologize, Glessi. I don't think I saw your hand in time for asking the question. I was sort of focused on the chat window, and I sort of missed the raised hand. But please, in the future, just send a private message to the chair to ask the question. Thank you very much for taking part in this panel. Every cook knows that to make a dish attractive, you have to add some butter and sugar to it, and it's going to be irresistible. But let's see what we are going to do with items such as opium tomorrow. There are other interesting commodities that are coming our way. So let's meet tomorrow and discuss the borders and commerce in the next panel. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.
Thanks.
Elena, would you be so kind to end the meeting?
Of course.